All right, so we are back at the Teradek booth at NAB 2017, and our next guest is Eric Chang from Facebook. He's been so busy with the F8 conference, but he gave us about 10 minutes of his time to talk about the X24 and X6 cameras, which are Facebook's two new 360 volumetric video cameras that I think the whole industry is pretty excited about. So Eric, tell us a little bit about the X24 and X6. I know you wanted to talk about, like, what is volumetric video by your definition?
Let's define those terms.
Yeah, so volumetric video is about including depth information in what is captured. So if you think about 2D video, we all know what that is, and into 360, and then, but we talk about stereoscopic as being 3D all the time. Those words are used interchangeably a lot, but stereoscopic is really the display of two 2D images, one to each eye, and there doesn't really need to be 3D like real 3D content behind the scenes. And so what our cameras do is capture RGB plus depth for every pixel in every one of the cameras in those rigs.
How does that manifest? So what? What does that mean? That sounds cool. What does that mean?
So, and you're totally right, because that's the raw data that's captured, but it doesn't mean that much. And what we need to do is then put it together into a scene, a 3D scene that's very similar to what you might get in a traditional computer game or in a VFX workflow with a full 3D scene in the background. And that's the kind of video content that we capture. So what that means is if you can play that back to someone, you can interact or move in the scene in 6 degrees of freedom, which is why we say 6 off all the time when we refer to the camera.
That's what I was getting to, that you can do this and it shifts. I can kind of...
Can you illustrate for us? Just do a little motion here, how much can you move?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We get that a lot. How much can you move? It really depends on the content and what your goals are for presentation as a content creator. So if you want to talk about live video, if your goal is to play back video in a way that's similar to, like, you capture reality, you play back reality, then your movements are really constrained by the volume of the capture volume. So, how big is the camera? What's the, how, like, if you want to look around an object, obviously if there's not a camera here, you can't look around that object. But when we talk to content creators, there are a lot of ways around that. And for example, if you capture a plate and the camera's not moving, then you have that shadow information, the point cloud shadow that's behind a subject. You can actually capture that before and then composite it in. So there are a lot of it's really dependent on what your goals are as a content creator and how you want to present that to your audience.
Gotcha.
Well, how did Facebook get into the 360 VR camera business? Like, it's more than the Facebook.com and sharing with family. It got Oculus, it purchased Oculus for a couple billion, and now it's launching new cameras.
So I wouldn't say that Facebook is in the camera business. So when we announced the Surround 360 Open Edition a year ago, that's an open source, hardware project. So
I looked up all the pieces and did the math, and that was way too expensive for me. Open source is great, but I could not afford it. I think it was like $50,000 or something like that.
Well, so
I didn't shop around for the parts, though. I didn't shop around for the parts. May have been a better discount.
You didn't do all your homework.
Well, one of the good things about making an open source and open hardware is you're not tied to those parts. And what we've seen is camera manufacturers use the Open Edition as a starting point to develop versions that aren't as expensive, that don't have a raw workflow, that use, they record onto SD cards, for example. And so it enables the ecosystem to come out with cameras at different price points for different kinds of audiences. And the X24 and X6 are going to be similar approaches. And they're not open source, but we'll be working with manufacturing partners to create cameras. So we don't sell the cameras, but our goal is to foster a new vibrant ecosystem around volumetric 6-off video.
And you have a camera in your pocket, so we get...
Yeah, it's actually back there. No, it's not here, unfortunately, at the show.
How will someone like content creators like Sarah and I get to see that camera? Or is it just a concept to push it forward to get other camera manufacturers to think about volumetric, the degrees?
So we're doing more than encouraging people to think about it. We will actually partner with camera manufacturers to ship a product at around the end of the year. So we've given kind of end of year as a time frame. But in addition to the camera itself, we're working on a full workflow, full tool chain ecosystem.
Yeah, I read that on your
website. The capture, you asked what does that data mean, and it means really nothing without the workflow. And so we're working with companies like Adobe, Foundry, Otoy, Metal, and also VFX in production houses to have that full tool chain so that when we launch the camera, content creators aren't stuck with the data that comes out of it. You have a tool chain that you can use to create your final product.
Yeah, I don't even know if my brain can like fathom that at this point. So show me when you have it.
We'll definitely do that. Yeah.
And then another question that we had was, it just slipped right out of my head. You know all of the questions that we had.
Well, what? There's the 6 camera and then the 24 camera. Is the difference between the camera the ability, the range of motion mainly? This is now. Can we make this the icon?
Yeah, sure.
The range of motion. Please put that in an ad. Is that the biggest difference between the two? Or is it the resolution because there are more cameras? What are the differences?
There are a couple of differences. So in these kinds of in this kind of camera design, there's always a trade-off between output spatial resolution and the amount of redundancy or overlap you have in capture.
Yes.
So the more overlap you have, oversampling you have,
the better the stitching, the
better
seam lines,
the accuracy of that depth. So
the
X24 sees every point in space 4 times. So we call it 4 times oversampling. And the X6 sees every point in space 3 times, but actually has lower output resolution. So each lens is wider. So in this industry, we talk about resolution as being in pixels per degree. If you say that is unambiguous. The output is something, some number of pixels per degree. That's right. And you have 360 degrees that you have to use. So those would be the trade-offs.
Great.
I guess I had more a practical question is the one that I had was from the open source throughout the year, what cameras have come out that have been based on that system? So
we have some companies like Reverge, for example. They built the system as designed and have been shooting, and the output has been really fantastic. We also have cameras from folks like Zcam, you just had on, I think, and also Kandao. So those two companies have built cameras based on it, and they will always say that they use the Surround 360 as a starting point to help really boost their efforts. And what it's done is, I think, accelerate the shipping of those cameras out into the industry, which is really Facebook's goal. And the goal is to get the tools that are necessary for immersive media content creation into people's hands so that they can share it.
We were talking before cylindrical cameras versus spherical cameras, and there was a change there. Can you talk about that? Like, what did you view as the difference? I just thought it was form factor with battery and adapter reasons. Yeah, well,
I think that's part of it. But the cylindrical rigs, a lot of them are actually using optical flow-based stitching tools, and Facebook has open sourced that stitcher, for example. So that's one way you can get into that. And so they're using cylindrical. Part of this actually has to do with the distribution mechanism. This kind of content is distributed as video content. They're encoded into video frames, normal video frames that you could pass through any production pipeline or distribution pipeline. And because of that, they're using this equirectangular 360 format, like the equirect projection. You're way into 360 now, so you know all this stuff. And so that's part of the reason that people have gone with it's called omni stereo panoramas, right? And you stack left, right, and right eye for stereo, but that's mono when you look up and down. So the scene actually goes to mono as you look up and goes to mono as you look down. So those cylindrical rigs are very well adapted to these kinds of distribution formats. But when you look into spherical rigs, they're capable of capturing real depth up and down, and of course that can no longer be distributed as normal video right now.
You had a question in terms of how is Facebook going to host all that data? What was the thing someone did?
Yeah, so I had heard that some of the light field or volumetric content that's being produced right now is 3 gigs a frame. How big are these file sizes, and how is Facebook going to be able to support file sizes like that?
So there's a difference between capture file size and distribution file size, and on the capture side, it will be very much dependent on the camera manufacturers that we partner with. So it could be that we have a raw workflow-based camera, which would be great for the very high end, and it could also be possible that someone does a version that's cheaper, just like what happened with their Open Edition. But on the distribution side, 6 stuff for volumetric video is quite big, and we see it right now in gaming. A lot of games are multi-gigabytes for download, so this is something that the whole industry will need to think about, and this is in fact why we've partnered with the entire tool chain, because this is fundamentally something that the whole industry needs to solve, and it's not going to be up to any one player to do it. So I think bandwidth has to get better. The fundamental, the native representation of this kind of format is still essentially unknown.
But Facebook is actively an active player there trying to push it forward. It's not just hardware or software, but it's also the distribution and the presentation of it on the timeline, if it comes down just to that.
Yes, I would say it's really about sharing content, and I think distribution obviously is the end point of that, and distribution at scale is what Facebook does.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we still have a few more minutes, so
awesome.
I know that.
So how many NABs have you been to? Is this your first?
I've been to quite a few now.
Okay, so good.
Yes.
So how have you seen this change? And especially, like we were talking about your background, you were at Lightro before, DJI, Facebook now. How have you seen the industry change in the 360 in the space?
Yeah.
Especially now with this show.
Well, I mean, I've just noticed there are 360 camera bags all over the place. When I sat down next to one, and then like Kinson was sitting in the corner, and so we're seeing a huge amount of interest in 360 right now, which is fantastic. And what I've been struck by is how quickly the industry en masse kind of moves towards these new possibilities for perspective, and that's really the space that has me most excited, is that the general idea that technology and creativity are kind of pushing towards this intersection and enabling these new kinds of perspectives that we haven't seen. And it's happening, in the span of like a year or two. We're seeing huge movements to push different things like drones and 360. And so it's really nice to be able to come to one place and see and get a sense of the trends that are going on.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Like we were walking around yesterday and we were just like, oh, that's so cool. Oh, that's so cool. No, that's the coolest. It's like no end.
And this is my first NAB. And I know NAB, I know all the industries here. Is it my perception that 360, that industry, and VR is just moving at a much faster rate than any other? Is that accurate?
I would say that it's
the innovation is just so damn fast.
I mean, it started lower in the curve, right? Because I think 360 has been pretty new, and so pretty much anything someone does to innovate has not been seen before. And so we're seeing that take off. But yes, absolutely. I think,
so I'll be less impressed in a year from now.
Well, I think we're still on that exponential. Yeah. We're at the beginning of that exponential curve, and I mean, all of this technology is moving really quickly, and yeah, it's been really exciting to see that.
What have you seen here at NAB that you've been most excited about? Like, what are some of the things that you've liked?
Have you had time to roam a little bit?
I've had a little bit of time, and it's a lot of the things that I have been involved with historically that seem to be pretty normal now. Like seeing a drone is pretty normal now. And I used to say all the time that I couldn't wait until drones were boring, and like they're not boring, definitely, but they're standard, and that's great. It's exciting to see this combination of drones, camera stabilization technology, expanding up to 360, and now kind of volumetric. These are all very exciting places to be working in, and I feel really fortunate to have been in the middle of some of those things.
Yeah, I feel like there's always something to talk about for sure.